Before we get into today's case, make sure to subscribe. By joining this community, you'll have access to detailed investigations. Let's get into the video. On the morning of June 17, 2018, in the quiet suburb of Lakewood, Colorado, the body of 37-year-old James Mitchell was discovered in his apartment. The blinds were drawn, the door was unlocked, and James was lying face down on his living room floor. Police responded to a 911 call from a neighbor who reported hearing a loud thud the previous night, followed by complete silence. What first appeared to be a natural death quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Someone had wanted James Mitchell dead. But who? As investigators began piecing together the final days of James' life, they uncovered a shocking web of betrayal stretching back months, perhaps years, involving James, his brother Robert, and Robert's wife Sarah. What emerged was a story of deception so profound, it would rock the foundations of an entire family. Detective Mark Salazar, the lead investigator assigned to the case, noted in his report that in all his years investigating homicides, he had never seen a case with so many layers. Every time they thought they had reached the bottom, another level would reveal itself. The Mitchell brothers had grown up just outside of Denver. Only 18 months apart, James and Robert had been close as children but drifted apart in their adult years. Robert, the elder brother, had followed a conventional path: college, marriage to his high school sweetheart Sarah, a steady job in finance, and a home in the suburbs. James had taken a different route. After dropping out of college, he moved between jobs, relationships, and apartments, never quite finding his footing. 3 years before his death, James had moved back to the Denver area after a stint in San Francisco. It was then that he reconnected with his brother Robert and, fatefully, with Sarah. The investigation began as a routine canvass of James' building. Neighbors described him as quiet and mostly keeping to himself. He had few visitors, with one notable exception: a woman in her mid-30s who would visit during weekday afternoons, typically staying for about 2 hours before leaving. The description matched Sarah Mitchell. Investigators found James' phone on his nightstand. The device was unlocked, and a quick scan revealed hundreds of text messages between James and Sarah dating back approximately 8 months. The messages painted a clear picture. James and Sarah had been having an affair. Detective Salazar's case notes indicated that they found messages where James and Sarah coordinated meeting times, made sure Robert wouldn't be home, and discussed their feelings for each other. It was a fully developed relationship, not just a physical affair. But the text messages also revealed a disturbing development from 2 weeks before James' death. Sarah had sent a series of increasingly frantic messages that read the following: "I just got the results. How could you do this to me? You knew, and you didn't tell me. You knew Robert is going to find out. Everything is going to fall apart." The lab results Sarah referenced were from her doctor's appointment. Sarah Mitchell had tested positive for HIV. Public health records confirmed what investigators already suspected. James Mitchell had been diagnosed with HIV 3 years earlier in San Francisco. He had been prescribed antiretroviral medication, but had stopped filling his prescriptions shortly after moving back to Colorado. Medical experts consulted by the investigation team concluded that James likely knew his status when the affair began. Detective Salazar noted in his report that at this point they had a possible motive, but they still needed to connect Robert to the crime scene. Security camera footage from James' apartment building showed Robert Mitchell entering through the main door at 9:47 p.m. on the night of June 15th, 2 days before James' body was discovered. The footage showed Robert leaving 32 minutes later. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but his distinctive walk and build were recognizable. When questioned by police, Robert Mitchell initially denied having seen his brother in the days before his death. When presented with the security footage, he amended his statement, claiming he had stopped by to discuss a family matter but found James in good health when he left. Detective Salazar's assessment was that Robert's story didn't add up, and he wasn't a convincing liar. The investigation took a decisive turn when forensic technicians found traces of Robert's DNA under James' fingernails, indicating a physical struggle. Additionally, fibers from Robert's jacket were found on the floor near James' body. 48 hours after James' body was discovered, Robert Mitchell was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But the story that would emerge during the investigation and subsequent trial was far more complex than a simple case of brotherly betrayal. It was a tragedy years in the making, with multiple victims and no true winners. To understand what really happened between the Mitchell brothers, investigators needed to look deeper into their shared history and the woman caught between them. Tara and Robert Mitchell had married young, high school sweethearts who wed shortly after graduation. They had built what appeared to be a stable, if somewhat conventional, life together. They owned a modest home in a good school district, despite not having children of their own. Robert had risen through the ranks at a local investment firm, while Sarah worked as an elementary school administrator. Diane Levinson, a close friend of Sarah's who was interviewed by investigators, stated that on paper they were the perfect couple, but she always sensed something was missing for Sarah. She had wanted children, but Robert kept postponing the conversation. The marriage had hit a rough patch around the time James returned to Colorado. Robert was working longer hours, often coming home late or traveling for business. Sarah later told investigators she felt increasingly isolated and unappreciated. When James re-entered their lives, he brought with him a charisma and spontaneity that had been missing from Sarah's daily routine. According to text messages recovered from both their phones, what began as innocent catch-up lunches gradually evolved into something more intimate. One text message from Sarah to James read, "I've never felt this alive. When I'm with you, I remember who I used to be before life became so predictable." For his part, James seemed equally invested in the relationship, though investigators would later question his sincerity, given what he knew and didn't disclose. Dr. Eleanor Fitch, a psychologist who consulted on the case, explained that the affair had been going on for about 7 months when Sarah received her diagnosis. The betrayal she experienced was twofold, not just the physical infidelity that might be discovered, but the life-altering medical secret that James had kept from her. Records from Sarah's physician confirmed she had no knowledge of her HIV status until a routine checkup revealed the infection. Her doctor, bound by confidentiality, could not disclose the likely source but did advise Sarah to inform any sexual partners immediately. Sarah's text messages to James grew increasingly desperate in the days following her diagnosis. "I have to tell Robert. I can't keep this secret. He's going to know it was you. We're the only ones I've been with. You've destroyed my life, our lives." James' responses were sporadic and defensive. "It's not a death sentence anymore. The meds will keep you healthy. Maybe it wasn't even me. You don't know that for sure. Robert doesn't need to know about us. Just say it was from something else." According to cell phone records, Sarah called Robert on June 14th, asking him to come home early from work. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the Mitchell home that evening. Detective Salazar's case notes indicated their belief that this was when Sarah told Robert everything about the affair, about her diagnosis, and about James' prior knowledge of his HIV status. The following day, Robert Mitchell left work early, telling colleagues he had a family emergency to attend to. His cell phone pinged towers near James' apartment complex at approximately 9:30 p.m., confirming his presence in the area. What exactly transpired inside James' apartment may never be fully known. The medical examiner determined James died from asphyxiation, with a head trauma occurring either during a struggle or after death. The position of the body and evidence at the scene suggested James had been taken by surprise. Forensic technician Dwayne Holloway noted in his report that there were no signs of forced entry, which indicated James knew his attacker and willingly let them in. The apartment wasn't ransacked. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. The following is a speculative reconstruction based on forensic evidence. While the investigation team believes this scenario aligns with available evidence, the exact sequence of events cannot be known with certainty. The case of Robert Mitchell's crime shocked not just the community of Lakewood, Colorado, but also the wider public. The scandal was the subject of daily headlines, and every new development seemed to raise more questions than it answered. As the media circus unfolded, one thing became clear. The Mitchell family would never be the same. While Robert was in custody awaiting trial, his past began to surface in unexpected ways. People who had known him before the tragedy painted a picture of a man who was reliable, steadfast, and loyal. In their eyes, Robert was the kind of person who would have been willing to do anything for his family. including forgiving and protecting them from harm. But as the events surrounding his brother's death came to light, many were left grappling with how someone they had known for years could snap under the pressure of such an overwhelming betrayal. Sarah Mitchell, too, found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. In the wake of the crime, she became the focal point of many discussions. To some, she was a victim of the affair, the disease, and the violence. To others, she was complicit in a situation that had spiraled out of control. Sarah remained mostly silent throughout the trial, though her testimony had been crucial in establishing the timeline of events that led to her husband's violent outburst. She had been a model wife, a supportive partner, and a loyal friend. At least, that's what everyone thought until the truth about her affair with her brother-in-law came to light. After the trial, Sarah's emotional state was further complicated by the divorce proceedings. While she was devastated by what had happened, she was also left trying to rebuild her life, both physically and emotionally. She continued to visit Robert regularly in prison, where she tried to reconcile her feelings of guilt, betrayal, and love. She still felt an odd attachment to her husband despite everything that had transpired between them, but she was equally burdened by the reality of the situation. She would have to confront the consequences of her actions, and her place in the world was now uncertain. Sarah's support system began to deteriorate. Her friends and family had mixed feelings about her, torn between empathy and anger. While some tried to console her, others couldn't understand how she could have put herself and her family in such a precarious situation. There were those who expressed sympathy for her diagnosis, understanding the heavy burden of living with HIV, but also a sense of betrayal. Many felt that she should have been more responsible in managing her relationships and sharing her medical status. She had, after all, exposed her husband to an illness he could not have expected, and that, to some, seemed unforgivable. Meanwhile, Robert's trial continued to unfold, and his defense team presented a compelling case for his emotional state at the time of the killing. His lawyers argued that Robert had acted in a moment of blind rage, triggered by a combination of the affair and the devastating news about Sarah's health. Robert, a man who had always kept his emotions tightly controlled, had reached a breaking point. His actions, they claimed, were the result of extraordinary psychological duress, not premeditated malice. They cited expert testimonies, including those of a psychiatrist who testified that Robert had been in a state of temporary insanity when he confronted his brother. The defense painted Robert as a man pushed to his limits by the most unimaginable of circumstances. The prosecution, however, argued that Robert had made a series of deliberate choices that led him to murder his brother and try to cover up the crime. They painted him as a man who, rather than seeking a more rational solution to his pain, had chosen violence. They focused on the lies Robert had told after the killing, as well as his attempts to clean up the crime scene. They emphasized that Robert was fully aware of the consequences of his actions and had intentionally sought to hide his involvement in James' death. During the trial, many of the details of Robert's childhood, his relationship with James, and his marriage to Sarah were revealed. Friends and family described a complex dynamic between the two brothers. Although they had grown up together, their relationship had always been fraught with competition. Robert, the older brother, had always been the more successful and traditional of the two. James, the younger brother, had always been the more rebellious and carefree one, moving from job to job and relationship to relationship. But despite their differences, they had a bond, one that had been tested by the affair. Their shared history complicated the situation. Robert had spent years helping James get back on his feet, but his feelings of betrayal were so deep that he had ultimately chosen to confront him in the worst possible way. The trial finally reached its conclusion, and after 4 grueling days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Robert Mitchell was guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The jury had acknowledged that Robert's actions were driven by intense emotional turmoil, but they had also recognized that he had crossed a line that could not be ignored. He had killed his brother in a fit of rage and had tried to cover it up. In sentencing, Judge Helen Matthews took into account the complex nature of the crime. She noted that while Robert's actions were driven by emotional distress, they still resulted in the death of a man who had once been his closest confidant. The judge sentenced Robert to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. The sentence, though harsh, was not the life sentence that many had anticipated, given the gravity of the crime. The community of Lakewood, though shaken by the events, tried to move forward. The Mitchell family was forever altered by the events that transpired. Robert's fate was sealed, but Sarah was left to navigate her own path, dealing with her illness, her past mistakes, and the damage done to her family. The Mitchell family's story was one of betrayal, secrets, and a tragic unraveling that could not be undone. For James Mitchell's friends and colleagues, the loss was profound. Many struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the tragic circumstances of his death. They were left with a haunting question: how had it all come to this? And for those closest to the case, the memory of the Mitchell family's unraveling would linger for years to come, a cautionary tale of how deeply betrayal could cut and how far-reaching the consequences could be. In the years that followed, Sarah attempted to rebuild her life. She became an advocate for HIV awareness, speaking openly about her diagnosis and the importance of regular testing. She also sought therapy, trying to make sense of the events that had torn her family apart. But no matter how hard she tried to move on, she could never escape the weight of the tragedy that had forever altered the course of her life. Robert, too, faced his own struggle. In prison, he spent his days reflecting on the decisions he had made. The remorse weighed heavily on him, and he began to write letters to his late brother, asking for forgiveness, though he knew it would never come. Robert eventually became involved in a prison rehabilitation program, helping other inmates work through their emotional and psychological struggles. But the pain of what he had done remained with him, a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. For both Sarah and Robert, the journey of healing was long and painful, and while they may have found some semblance of peace in the years that followed, the shadows of their past would never fully fade. Their story served as a reminder of the destructive power of betrayal and the complex web of emotions that can drive a person to do the unthinkable. As the months passed, the Mitchell family's tragedy became the stuff of local legend. The community of Lakewood was divided. Some viewed Robert and Sarah as victims of a cruel twist of fate, while others saw them as perpetrators who had turned their lives into a nightmare of their own making. For Sarah, the emotional and psychological toll of the entire situation continued to unfold in unexpected ways. 3 months after Robert's conviction, Sarah was going through her late husband's belongings in an attempt to sort through their past and maybe find some healing. Tucked away in a hidden drawer, she discovered a letter, an old letter, dated just 2 weeks before the murder. It wasn't written by Robert, but by James. The letter was addressed to Sarah, and it was a confession. The letter revealed an astonishing twist. James had been planning to leave Sarah. He had intended to break off their affair, realizing the gravity of their actions. He also confessed that he had intended to tell Robert the truth about the affair and Sarah's HIV status. James had come to the conclusion that the relationship was toxic and had been consuming him for months, and he was going to confess everything to Robert before the affair destroyed any more of their lives. However, as Sarah read the letter, it was clear that he had been too afraid, too entangled in his own emotional confusion, to face the consequences. The discovery of this letter changed everything for Sarah. It felt like an eerie betrayal from beyond the grave, as if James had been trying to absolve himself of guilt even after his death. Could Robert's violent outburst have been a reaction to a conversation that never took place? Could Robert have avoided the murder if he had learned of the affair earlier, directly from James? As Sarah began to grapple with the aftermath of the letter, she received a mysterious phone call late one night. The voice on the other end was gruff, distorted, and hard to recognize, but the message was clear. James had not been the only one with secrets. The caller claimed that there was another person, someone much closer to the family, who had been hiding crucial information that could change the outcome of Robert's trial. Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't place the voice, but it sounded like someone who knew more than they were letting on. The caller refused to reveal their identity, but they told Sarah that they had a recording, something that would prove that Robert had been provoked into his actions by someone else, someone close to him, someone who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. They hinted that this individual had a long history with the Mitchell family, someone who had once been a trusted confidant. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. Sarah, in a panic, started reaching out to the people she thought she could trust. One name that stood out in her mind was David Connor, an old college friend of Robert's who had distanced himself from the family over the years but had once been a close confidant to both Robert and James. David had been silent throughout the trial, never coming forward with any information. However, Sarah knew that he had always been protective of Robert, especially in their younger days. When Sarah reached out to David, he agreed to meet her at a local coffee shop. There, he revealed something shocking. David had been the one who initially introduced James to Sarah. He had known about the affair for months, but he had stayed silent, feeling guilty for what he had set in motion. He told Sarah that, on the night of the murder, he had received a frantic phone call from James, a call where James admitted to feeling cornered by Robert's suspicion. David claimed that James had told him that Robert had already discovered the affair and was planning to confront him that night. David also admitted that he had been the one to suggest the confrontation. He had thought that a private discussion between Robert and James would be the best way to deal with the situation, believing that the truth could somehow fix the mess. However, he now realized that he had pushed James into a corner, and the tragic chain of events had been set into motion the moment Robert arrived at the house. David, however, was not finished. He revealed that someone had been pulling strings from behind the scenes, someone who had been manipulating both Robert and James for years. It was a revelation that turned Sarah's world upside down. Twist 4. The True Mastermind. David's cryptic statement led Sarah to suspect that there was more to the story than just the affair and Robert's violent reaction. She dug deeper into the lives of those closest to the Mitchell family, and what she uncovered shocked her. The true mastermind behind the tragedy was not Robert or James, but their estranged father, Charles Mitchell. Charles had been a volatile figure in the Mitchell family, a man whose influence was felt even after he had distanced himself from them many years ago. It turned out that Charles had been secretly manipulating both of his sons through subtle emotional blackmail and guilt-tripping. He had planted seeds of doubt in Robert's mind about James's loyalty, using his own disappointment in both sons to fuel a sense of betrayal. Sarah unearthed old letters and bank transactions that showed that Charles had been in contact with both Robert and James before the murder. In some cases, he had offered financial incentives for certain actions, pushing Robert further down a path of anger and confusion. It became clear that Charles had been encouraging Robert to confront James, baiting him with the belief that James was intentionally undermining his place in the family. Charles had seen Robert as his heir, the one who would carry on his legacy, and James as a disappointment. But by sowing division, he had inadvertently played a pivotal role in setting the tragic events in motion. The tapes Sarah discovered between Charles and his sons painted a damning picture of a father who had been manipulating his family for years. Sarah's investigation led her to a final, unexpected twist, an opportunity for redemption. Armed with the truth about her father-in-law's role, Sarah was able to work with her lawyer to reopen Robert's case. The new revelations prompted the court to re-evaluate the evidence, particularly the psychological factors influencing Robert's actions. With the fresh insight into the extent of Charles Mitchell's influence on his sons, Robert's defense team pushed for a new trial, and the possibility of a reduced sentence or even parole for him. In a gripping final twist, the court found that the emotional manipulation of Robert and James by Charles Mitchell played a critical role in the tragic events. While Robert still faced consequences for his actions, his sentence was significantly reduced, and he was granted parole after serving 3 years. This, however, didn't erase the deep emotional scars. As for Sarah, the truth had finally set her free. Though the road to healing was long, she began to rebuild her life with a new sense of purpose, becoming a vocal advocate for mental health and familial manipulation. The Mitchell family tragedy was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, it seemed like there might be light at the end of the tunnel. As the courtroom doors closed behind Sarah, a heavy weight lifted from her chest. The trial had taken a toll on her like nothing she had ever endured. But with each revelation that came to light, there was a deeper sense of peace settling in. Robert's reduced sentence felt like a bittersweet victory. He had made amends for his actions, but the emotional scars would remain for a lifetime. His time in prison had been hard, a deep reflection of the trauma that had once consumed him. Sarah never stopped visiting him, not as the woman who once stood by him as a wife, but as someone who had witnessed the destructive power of guilt, betrayal, and manipulation. In the end, Robert had been held accountable for his actions, but it was clear that he was not the only one responsible. The truth had not been easy to uncover, but the community now saw the full picture. The once invisible force that had pushed Robert to the edge, his father, Charles Mitchell, was no longer a shadow looming over the family. The court had not only granted Robert a second chance, but the family's dark history of manipulation was exposed, giving them the opportunity to heal. As Sarah left the courthouse that final day, her mind was clear. She had fought for justice, for truth, and for the family she had once loved. The pain of betrayal still stung, but she had faced the demons head-on. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding, both her life and the fragmented pieces of her heart. The Mitchell family, fractured by years of lies, manipulation, and unspoken truths, had finally been forced to confront their darkest moments. And for the first time in a long while, justice was served, not just through the courts, but through the healing process that came with the truth being laid bare. The final twist came in the form of the family's legacy, no longer defined by tragedy and secrecy, but by a new path forward. Robert was eventually released from prison on parole, his life now dedicated to making amends for the mistakes he had made. The Mitchell family began to rebuild from the ruins of their past, seeking redemption where it was still possible. For Sarah, there was no grand celebration, no fireworks or fanfare. Instead, it was a quiet sense of closure that washed over her in the stillness of the night. She had fought for justice, for the truth to be heard, and in the end, she found peace not through the punishment of others, but through her own journey toward healing. In the aftermath of it all, the community of Lakewood began to reflect on their own biases, their own misconceptions about the Mitchell family. The story that had once seemed like a tale of senseless violence and tragic mistakes was now understood in its fuller, tragic complexity. And while there would always be whispers of what had happened, there was also the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always, eventually. As Sarah stood at her front door one last time, looking out at the horizon, she knew that the family she once thought she would never heal from had begun to heal without her. And in that realization, she felt a quiet kind of freedom. Justice had been served. If you want to continue exploring these complex and unsettling cases, hit that subscribe button. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and be part of the journey as we seek the truth together. Check out the next video to know how we uncovered the truth. See you there.